The winter of 1925 did not so much arrive in New York City as it did lay siege to it. It was a brutal, relentless conqueror, turning the majestic canyons of Manhattan into windswept tunnels of ice and despair. The city, in the throes of its Roaring Twenties delirium, tried to fight back. From the glowing windows of Park Avenue mansions and the steamy entrances of underground speakeasies, the defiant sounds of jazz music spilled into the night, a syncopated heartbeat refusing to be silenced. The air, thick with the scent of coal smoke, roasted chestnuts and exhaust from a million new automobiles, was a testament to a city that never slept, not even under the tyranny of a blizzard. But on a forgotten corner in the Lower East Side, where the bright lights of Broadway were a distant, hazy promise, the city's grand symphony was nothing but a mournful whisper. Here, the wind had teeth. It gnawed through threadbare coats and found the cracks in tenement walls, a constant whining reminder of its power. It was here, huddled in the shallow doorway of a pawn shop whose gate was already drawn for the night, that Eleanor Vance was slowly freezing to death. She had long ago lost feeling in her toes, and the numbness was now making a slow, insidious climb up her calves. Her hands, shoved deep into the pockets of her thin wool coat, were clumsy, useless things. She pressed her cheek against the cold wrought iron bars of the gate, the metal so frigid it felt like a brand against her skin. It was a small, sharp pain that served a single, vital purpose. It reminded her that she was still alive. For now. 2 hours earlier, she had stood in line at the St. Ambrose Mission, her stomach a tight, aching knot of hunger. When she had finally reached the door, a weary-eyed man had given her a sad shake of his head. "No more room, miss. God be with you." The door had closed, and with it the last of her hope had evaporated into the biting air, as ephemeral as the white clouds of her own breath. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she leaned her head back, her gaze falling upon the skeletal form of a new skyscraper being erected miles away. Its dark frame was a web of steel against the bruised purple sky, a symbol of the city's relentless ambition. That world of progress and possibility felt as distant as the moon. Her world had shrunk to this single frozen patch of pavement. Her mind, a traitor seeking warmth in the embers of memory, drifted back to the life she had lost. It had only been 3 months, but it felt like a lifetime ago. She had been Nurse Vance then, head surgical nurse at Mount Sinai, one of the city's most prestigious hospitals. She had been respected, admired for her steady hands, her quick thinking, her unwavering compassion. Her small apartment had been warm, her future a clear, bright line. The man who had shattered it all was Dr. Alistair Finch, a celebrated surgeon whose reputation was as brilliant as his character was rotten. He was a man who believed his power in the operating theatre extended to all other aspects of his life. His advances had started as sly compliments, then escalated to lingering touches on her arm, and finally to a crude, whispered proposition in the sterile confines of his private office. Eleanor could still feel the phantom sensation of his breath on her neck, the slick confidence in his voice, as he'd suggested a mutually beneficial arrangement. She remembered the shock, the revulsion, and the cold, clarifying anger that had followed. Her rejection had been swift and absolute. His surprise had been comical, quickly curdling into a dark, vindictive fury. He was a man unaccustomed to the word no. His revenge was not swift, but methodical. A quiet word in the ear of the hospital administrator, a fabricated report of her insubordination and emotional instability. Suddenly, her work, once praised, was under constant, unforgiving scrutiny. A minor error was grounds for a formal reprimand. A suggestion for improving efficiency was labeled as an attempt to undermine authority. He poisoned the well, and within a month, she was dismissed for conduct unbecoming of a Mount Sinai nurse. The blacklisting had been brutally effective. Dr. Finch's influence was far-reaching. Every hospital she applied to returned her letters with a curt, formal rejection. Her savings dwindled. Her friends, other nurses terrified for their own positions, grew distant. She was an outcast, a pariah in the only profession she had ever loved. All she had left was her small leather medical bag, a relic of her former life. It sat on the ground beside her now, its worn leather cold to the touch. Inside, her certificates of training lay beside her few remaining instruments, a testament to an identity that had been stolen from her. A sudden blinding glare of light pierced the swirling snow, jolting her from her reverie. A colossal automobile, a Rolls-Royce Phantom, its black paint gleaming like wet obsidian even in the dim light, had mounted the curb and was sliding to a halt mere feet from where she stood. The chauffeur's door was already opening, but it was the rear door that commanded her attention. A man emerged, stepping out into the storm with an air of unhurried authority. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored overcoat that the wind seemed hesitant to challenge. A black fedora was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but there was no mistaking the aura of power that surrounded him. He moved with a confident, athletic grace, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the snow-dusted pavement. "Is everything all right, Patrick?" the man asked his driver, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried easily over the wind. "A patch of ice, sir, my apologies. The roads in this part of town are treacherous." The man's attention shifted from his driver to the huddled figure in the doorway. He took a few steps closer, and for the first time Eleanor could see his face more clearly. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a strong jaw and a clean-shaven, almost ascetic face. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startlingly clear shade of grey, intelligent and discerning, and they were looking at her not with pity or disgust, but with an intense, analytical curiosity. This was Julian Croft, the architect, the industrialist, the visionary. He was returning from a late-night inspection of a new public works project, a free hospital for women and children he was funding himself, a project he had kept anonymous. He was tired, his mind still wrestling with the complex logistics of steel and stone, when his car had swerved. Now this woman stood before him, a stark human problem that overshadowed all his architectural dilemmas. He took in the scene in an instant, the threadbare coat that had once been of fine quality, the rigid set of her shoulders that spoke of a pride that refused to break, the worn leather bag at her feet with the faint, embossed medical cross on its side. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, his voice softer now, directed at her. Eleanor wanted to answer, to assure this imposing stranger that she was fine, that she needed no help. But her body betrayed her. A violent, uncontrollable shiver seized her, and her teeth chattered so hard that words were an impossibility. She could only manage a small, jerky nod, which she immediately regretted as it sent another wave of dizziness through her. Julian stepped closer still, his imposing frame blocking the wind. He could see the faint blue tinge of her lips, the alarming pallor of her skin. This was not mere discomfort. This was dangerous. "You're a nurse," he stated, his sharp eyes fixed on her medical bag. Again, she just nodded, hugging herself tighter. "You need to get out of this storm," he said, his tone shifting from questioning to commanding. He was a man used to solving problems, and the problem in front of him was a woman on the verge of collapse. "My car is warm. Let me take you somewhere safe." A flicker of her old fire returned. "I don't need charity," she managed to say, her voice a hoarse whisper. Julian's expression didn't change, but a flicker of respect entered his eyes. "This is not charity, miss. It is common sense. To leave you here would be an act of barbarism. I will not have it." He unbuttoned his heavy overcoat. The gesture was so unexpected it startled her. He shrugged it off, and before she could protest, he draped it over her shoulders. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. The coat was incredibly heavy, lined with fur, and it still carried the radiating warmth of his own body. The scent of him, clean, expensive wool, a faint trace of cedar and something else, something like old books and ambition, enveloped her. For the first time in hours, a genuine warmth began to seep into her frozen core, so potent it made her gasp. "Can you walk?" he asked. She tried. She pushed herself away from the iron gate, but her legs, stiff and numb, refused to cooperate. They buckled beneath her. She didn't hit the ground. With a swift, fluid motion that belied his size, Julian Croft scooped her up into his arms. The shock of it jolted through her. To be held, to be lifted as if she weighed nothing at all. He held her securely against his chest, her head resting just below his shoulder. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart through the fine material of his suit jacket. He bent slightly to retrieve her medical bag, tucking it safely beside her. "The St. Regis is a few blocks from here," he said, his voice a low rumble by her ear as he carried her toward the gleaming Rolls-Royce. "We'll get you a room, some hot food, and call for a doctor." As the chauffeur held the door open, Eleanor found herself being deposited onto the plush leather seat of the car's interior. The world inside was silent, warm, and smelled faintly of leather and success. The door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, shutting out the howling wind and the cruel, indifferent city. She looked at the man settling in the seat across from her. He was a complete stranger, a titan from a world entirely separate from her own. She didn't know his intentions, didn't know anything about him except that his coat was the warmest thing she had ever felt, and his arms had been the first safe place she had known in months. As the great car pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the ghost on the corner behind, Eleanor Vance couldn't help but feel a tiny, fragile spark ignite in the frozen depths of her heart. It was a terrifying, unfamiliar, and utterly wonderful feeling. Hope. The lobby of the St. Regis Hotel was a world away from the biting reality of the streets Eleanor had just left. It was a masterpiece of Gilded Age opulence, a warm golden cavern of gleaming marble floors, intricate ceiling frescoes, and colossal bronze chandeliers that dripped with crystal light. The air was still and warm, scented with the faint, expensive perfume of its wealthy patrons, and the crisp, clean aroma of fresh flowers that bloomed defiantly in ornate vases, mocking the blizzard that raged outside. As Julian Croft strode through the lobby, carrying Eleanor as if she were a precious, fragile artifact, a wave of silent, stunned deference parted the way for him. Bellhops froze mid-step, their faces a mixture of shock and professional servility. A woman dripping in pearls and sable paused her conversation, her mouth slightly agape. This was not a common sight. Julian seemed utterly oblivious to the stir they were causing. His focus was singular, his destination clear. He approached the front desk, where the night manager, a man named Mr. Abernathy with a meticulously waxed mustache and an air of perpetual unflappability, was visibly flapped. "Mr. Croft, sir," Abernathy stammered, his eyes darting from Julian's determined face to the pale, still form in his arms. Is everything quite all right?" "I require your finest suite, Abernathy," Julian said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the manager's alarm. "Immediately, and send for Dr. Evans. Tell him it is a personal and urgent matter. Also have the hotel seamstress send up a selection of simple, warm clothing for the lady, and a meal, soup, tea, something substantial. Now." Each command was delivered with a quiet, absolute authority that invited no questions. Abernathy, galvanized into action, fumbled for a key. "Of course, sir. The presidential suite. It's prepared. Right away." He gestured to a nearby bellhop. "Assist Mr. Croft with the lady." "I have her," Julian stated flatly, already moving toward the grand, sweeping staircase. Eleanor was only vaguely aware of the procession. She was caught in a disorienting dream state, the sudden warmth of the hotel causing a painful, tingling sensation to flood her numb extremities. It felt as if her blood, having slowed to a frozen crawl, was now being forced through her veins at a boiling pace. She was aware of the soft, plush runner beneath Julian's feet, the hushed whispers that followed them, the dizzying ascent up the stairs. She kept her eyes closed, pressing her face against the comforting solidity of Julian's chest. The rhythmic, steady beat of his heart was the only thing that felt real in this surreal tableau. He carried her into a suite that was less a room and more a palatial apartment. He didn't place her on the magnificent canopy bed, but on a plush velvet armchair beside a large unlit fireplace. He gently removed his own heavy coat from her shoulders, and the loss of its immediate warmth made her shiver again, though the room itself was temperate. "The fire will be lit in a moment," he said, his voice softer now that they were alone. He worked with a surprising efficiency, arranging the kindling and logs in the hearth with the same focused precision he might apply to a complex architectural diagram. Within moments, a small flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows across the room. A series of quiet, efficient knocks at the door, announced the arrival of the hotel staff. A maid entered with an armful of clothes, simple wool dresses, stockings, undergarments, and laid them carefully on the bed. A waiter followed with a silver tray laden with food, the aroma of hot beef broth making Eleanor's stomach clench with a hunger so intense it was painful. Julian dismissed them with a quiet word and a generous tip, his movements economical and decisive. He poured a cup of steaming tea, adding a dollop of honey from a small porcelain pot. He brought it to her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he guided the cup to her lips. "Slowly," he cautioned. "The doctor will be here soon, but warmth and nourishment are the first steps." Eleanor took a tentative sip. The hot, sweet liquid was a balm to her frozen insides. It was the most exquisite thing she had ever tasted. She looked at this man, this stranger, who was now tending to her with a focused, impersonal kindness that was both baffling and deeply comforting. "Why?" she whispered, her voice still raspy. "Why are you doing this?" Julian had moved to the window and was staring out at the swirling vortex of the blizzard, his back to her. "Because leaving a human being to freeze on a street corner is an unacceptable failure of civic and moral duty," he said, as if stating a self-evident engineering principle. "The city is a system. It breaks down when its components are allowed to fail so catastrophically." It was the strangest, most detached explanation she could have imagined. He spoke of her plight not in terms of compassion, but in terms of a systemic flaw. And yet his actions were the very definition of compassion. He was a puzzle, a man of immense wealth, who spoke like a philosopher king and acted like a good Samaritan. Dr. Evans arrived shortly thereafter, a portly, competent man with kind eyes who clearly held Mr. Croft in high esteem. He examined Eleanor with a professional gentleness, confirming what Julian had already surmised: exhaustion, malnutrition, and the dangerous onset of hypothermia. He gave her a mild sedative to calm the violent shivering and prescribed rest and warmth. "You were very fortunate, young lady," the doctor said as he packed his bag. "A few more hours out there. Well, best not to think about it. You are in the best possible hands now." He gave Julian a respectful nod and departed. After the doctor left, an awkward silence descended upon the room. Eleanor, wrapped in a thick hotel robe, sat by the fire, slowly eating the soup. Julian stood by the mantelpiece, one arm resting upon it, observing her with that same unnerving, analytical gaze. "I will leave you to rest," he said finally. "The suite is yours for as long as you need it. All expenses are taken care of. When you are feeling stronger, we can discuss your plans." "Mr. Croft," Eleanor said, finding her voice. It was stronger now, fueled by the hot soup and the sheer, overwhelming strangeness of her situation. "You don't know me. You don't know why I was on that street. For all you know, I am a woman of low character, a thief, or worse." He turned his head slightly, his grey eyes meeting hers in the firelight. "I know that you are a nurse," he said. "I know that you have been educated. It is evident in your speech, despite your current circumstances. I know that you were desperate, but you still possessed too much pride to accept what you perceived as charity. And I know," he added, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to her hands, which were clutching the soup bowl, "that your hands are those of a worker, not a grifter. They are clean, the nails are short, and the skin, though chapped from the cold, shows the telltale signs of frequent, harsh scrubbing. The hands of a surgeon or a nurse." Eleanor was stunned into silence. He had seen all of that in a single fleeting glance. He saw her not as a pathetic creature to be pitied, but as a professional whose circumstances were at odds with her identity. "Rest, miss," he prompted. "Vance," she supplied. "Eleanor Vance." "Rest, Miss Vance," he repeated. He gave a slight, formal nod and walked towards the door. "My office will call on you tomorrow to see what you require." And with that he was gone, leaving her alone in a sea of opulence, the warmth of the fire on her skin, and the echo of his strange, perceptive kindness in her heart. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to a world transformed. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a city draped in a pristine, glittering blanket of white. Sunlight streamed through the large windows of the suite, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She felt weak, but the deep, aching cold had finally left her bones. She dressed in one of the simple dark blue wool dresses the seamstress had provided. It fit perfectly. A light knock came at the door. It was not a hotel employee, but Julian Croft himself. He held a small tray with a pot of coffee and a single perfect pastry. "I thought you might be feeling stronger this morning," he said, his expression as serious and unreadable as ever. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, suddenly self-conscious. "Mr. Croft, I have no way to repay you for this." "Repayment is not required," he said, setting the tray on a small table by the window. He poured 2 cups of coffee. "However, I would like to talk to you about your situation, if you are willing. I confess, it presents a logical inconsistency that I find compelling." Eleanor sat opposite him, cradling the warm coffee cup. "A logical inconsistency?" "Indeed," he said, taking a sip of his own coffee. Her trained, prideful nurse, alone and destitute on a street corner in the middle of a blizzard. The elements do not align. It suggests a backstory of some significance. "I'm not asking out of idle curiosity, Miss Vance. I'm asking because I may have a proposition for you, but I will not make it without understanding the full context." And so, for the second time in less than 24 hours, Eleanor found herself telling her story to this powerful, enigmatic stranger. She told him about her career, her passion for healing, and the ugly, career-ending confrontation with Dr. Finch. As she spoke, she watched Julian's face. He did not react with emotional outrage, but with a quiet, intense focus. His jaw tightened, and a muscle twitched almost imperceptibly along his cheek. It was the contained, controlled anger of a man who detested injustice not because it was cruel, but because it was disorderly. It was a disruption of the way things ought to be. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the city below. "This Dr. Finch," he said finally. "He abused his position of power to ruin a subordinate who would not submit to his advances. A gross inefficiency and a moral failing that creates a stain on a noble profession." He turned his gaze back to her. "I have a project, Miss Vance. My primary project, in fact. I am building the new Croft Tower, the tallest building in the world. It is a massive undertaking, employing over 3,000 men. The work is dangerous, accidents happen. Broken bones, falls, burns. We have a rudimentary first aid station, but it is inadequate." He leaned forward, his grey eyes locking onto hers. "I require a head nurse for the Croft Tower construction site, someone to establish and run a proper infirmary, someone with surgical training, administrative skills, and the fortitude to work in a challenging, male-dominated environment. The salary would be substantial. You would have your own staff, a budget for the finest equipment, and complete autonomy in all medical matters. The position requires skill, courage, and unimpeachable integrity." He paused. "You, Miss Vance, appear to possess all three. The offer is yours. A chance to build something new, to practice your profession with the respect and resources you deserve, and to put the injustice of your past behind you." Eleanor sat, stunned. It was an offer beyond anything she could have conceived. It was not a lifeline, it was a launching pad. He was offering her a chance not just to survive, but to thrive, to take her stolen identity and forge it into something stronger on the grandest stage imaginable. "Why me?" she asked, the question a genuine, heartfelt query. "You could hire anyone." "Perhaps," Julian conceded. "But you have something other candidates may not. You have experienced the failure of a system firsthand. You understand the importance of a structure built on integrity." And he added, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time, "You are not easily intimidated. I suspect you will manage a crew of steelworkers with admirable efficiency." He stood up, his tall frame silhouetted against the bright morning sun. "The choice is yours, Miss Vance. A new beginning, a chance to build. What do you say?" Eleanor looked from his outstretched hand to the sprawling, sun-drenched city outside her window. Yesterday, it had been her enemy. Today, it was a kingdom of possibility, and this man was offering her the keys. "I say yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, Mr. Croft. I accept." The following Monday, a black town car, dispatched by Julian Croft, arrived to collect Eleanor from the St. Regis. As she stepped out of the hotel's gilded lobby and into the crisp morning air, she felt like a different person from the desperate creature who had been carried through its doors just days before. Dressed in a practical but new navy blue dress, her medical bag clutched in her hand like a familiar shield, she was no longer a victim of circumstance, but a professional on her way to her first day at a new, formidable post. The car journeyed away from the genteel elegance of Midtown, plunging into the raw, beating heart of the city's industry. The destination was a testament to human audacity, the construction site of the Croft Tower. Long before she saw it, she heard it. It was a deafening, percussive symphony of progress. The thunderous clang of hammers on steel beams, the high-pitched scream of industrial saws, the guttural roar of engines, and the constant shouts of men, their voices rising and falling in a chaotic but purposeful rhythm. When the car finally stopped, she stepped out and craned her neck. The tower was a skeletal leviathan, a web of iron and steel that clawed its way into the winter sky, disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. It was less a building and more a vertical city in the making, teeming with life. Hundreds of men looking like ants from the ground swarmed over its frame, walking across narrow beams with a terrifying, casual grace. The sheer scale of it was dizzying, a display of power and ambition that made her feel both infinitesimally small and part of something monumental. A man detached himself from a group near the site's entrance and strode towards her. He was built like an ox with a broad chest, fists the size of small hams, and a weathered, ruddy face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. His eyes, however, were a sharp, intelligent blue. "You the nurse?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. He didn't bother to hide the skepticism in his tone. He looked her up and down, taking in her slender frame and neat dress, his gaze lingering for a moment on her pristine medical bag. He clearly found the sight of her incongruous, like a porcelain doll dropped into a coal mine. "I am," Eleanor replied, meeting his gaze directly. She would not be intimidated. "Eleanor Vance." "Mike O'Connell," he said, giving a curt nod. "I'm the foreman. Mr. Croft said you'd be arriving this way." He led her through the organized chaos of the ground level. Men paused their work to stare, their expressions ranging from open curiosity to outright amusement. Eleanor kept her chin high, her focus straight ahead, ignoring the low whistles and muttered comments. She was in their world now, a foreign entity, and she knew that respect here would not be given. It would have to be earned, inch by painful inch. O'Connell led her to a large, newly constructed wooden building, set slightly apart from the main hive of activity. A simple sign was already being painted on the door: Infirmary. "This is you," O'Connell said, pushing the door open. "Mr. Croft had it built special last week. Said he wanted a proper clinic, not just a tent with some bandages." The inside was spacious and clean, smelling strongly of fresh-cut pine and antiseptic. It was a blank slate. Crates of medical supplies were stacked against one wall. A new examination table stood in the center of the room, still wrapped in protective canvas. There were empty metal cabinets, a desk and chair, and a small partitioned-off area with 2 cots. Beyond that was a small office for her. It was stark, functional, and to Eleanor's eyes, beautiful. It was a space of her own, a kingdom to command. "Power's connected and the water's running. There's a list of all the supplies in this crate here," O'Connell said, tapping a large wooden box. "If you need anything else, you let me know, though I'm hoping we won't be seeing too much of you, if you take my meaning." "I take your meaning perfectly, Mr. O'Connell," Eleanor said, her voice crisp and professional. "My goal is to ensure the health and safety of your men, so they can continue their work without incident. Prevention is as much a part of my job as treatment." A flicker of surprise registered in his blue eyes. He had expected a delicate, easily flustered woman. He was met instead with a calm professional who spoke his language, efficiency and work. He grunted, a sound that was not quite approval, but a step away from dismissal. "Right then. The men have been told to report here for any injury, no matter how small. Good luck to you, nurse." He turned and left, the door closing with a solid thud, leaving Eleanor alone in her new domain. For the rest of the day, Eleanor worked with a focused, tireless energy. She unpacked every crate, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She organized bandages, antiseptic, surgical tools, and medicines into the metal cabinets, creating a system of logical order out of the chaos of the boxes. She set up the examination table, sterilized her instruments, and prepared a logbook to document every treatment. As she worked, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she'd been starving for. This wasn't the polished, hierarchical world of Mount Sinai. This was raw, essential, and entirely hers. Late in the afternoon, Julian Croft appeared at the infirmary door. He had changed from his morning suit into more practical attire, sturdy boots, trousers, and a heavy wool coat. He looked every bit the commander surveying his field of operations. He didn't speak at first, simply stood in the doorway, his keen eyes taking in the transformation of the space. He noted the neatly organized shelves, the pristine examination area, the clear sense of order she had imposed. "I see you have been busy, Miss Vance," he said, a note of approval in his voice. "There was much to be done, Mr. Croft," she replied, wiping her hands on a clean cloth. "The supplies you provided are excellent, though I'll have a list of a few additional items for you by the end of the day." "Of course," he said, stepping inside. "Are the conditions acceptable?" "They are more than acceptable. They are a testament to your commitment to your men's welfare." "A healthy workforce is a productive workforce," he stated, his characteristic pragmatism surfacing. "It is a matter of efficiency as much as morality." He walked through the clinic, his gaze missing nothing. "How have you found Mr. O'Connell and the others?" "Wary," Eleanor answered honestly. "Which is to be expected. Trust is not built in a single day." "No," Julian agreed. "It is not." He paused, looking at her with that intense, analytical expression. "They will see your value soon enough. Competence has a way of making itself indispensable." As if on cue, the infirmary door burst open. Two burly workers entered, supporting a third man between them. The injured man's face was pale, and he was cursing a blue streak, his left hand wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. "What happened?" Eleanor asked, her voice immediately shifting into the calm, authoritative tone of a nurse in charge. "Piece of rebar slipped, miss," one of the men said. "Gave Jimmy here a nasty gash." "Bring him over to the table," she commanded. "Mr. Croft, if you would be so kind as to wait outside." It wasn't a request, it was a professional directive, a clear demarcation of her space. Julian, to his credit, gave a single, understanding nod and stepped out, closing the door behind him. Eleanor worked swiftly. She had one of the men apply pressure while she washed her hands and put on sterile gloves. With a steady hand, she removed the filthy rag. The wound was deep, a ragged tear across the palm of the man's hand, bleeding profusely. It was full of grease and grime from the construction site. The injured man, Jimmy, winced and swore as she began to clean it. "Hold still, Jimmy," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I know it hurts, but if I don't clean this properly, you'll lose the hand not to the cut, but to the infection that follows." Her directness, her lack of fuss, seemed to get through to him. He gritted his teeth and held still. She meticulously cleaned the wound, her movements precise and economical. She then expertly applied a local anesthetic she had prepared and began to stitch the gash closed. Her sutures were small, neat, and efficient, the work of a skilled surgical nurse. The other two workers watched, their initial amusement replaced by a grudging respect. This woman knew what she was doing. When she was finished, she bandaged the hand securely. "You're done for the day, Jimmy," she said, her tone softening slightly. "And likely the next two as well. Keep it clean and dry. Come back tomorrow morning so I can check for any signs of infection. No arguments." "Yes, miss," Jimmy mumbled, clearly impressed. As the men left, Eleanor began cleaning her instruments. The door opened again and Julian stepped back inside, his eyes questioning. "He'll be fine," she told him. "He'll have a scar, but he'll keep the hand." "I had no doubt," Julian said quietly. He stood there for a moment longer, watching her. The last rays of the afternoon sun slanted through the infirmary window, illuminating the focused, determined set of her jaw. She was a woman of substance, a woman of skill, a woman who had faced down a room of skeptical, hardened men and had, in the span of 15 minutes, begun to earn their respect through sheer, undeniable competence. In that moment, she was no longer just the woman he had rescued from the snow. She was a vital, indispensable part of his grand enterprise. And as he stood there, watching her in the quiet of the clinic she now commanded, Julian Croft felt a stir of admiration that was beginning to feel dangerously, compellingly, like something more. "I will see you tomorrow, Miss Vance," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Mr. Croft," she replied, giving a professional nod. He left, and Eleanor stood for a moment in the silence of her new infirmary. The day had been long and challenging. She was exhausted. But as she looked around at the ordered shelves, the clean floors, and the setting sun casting long shadows from the cathedral of steel outside her window, she felt a profound sense of satisfaction. She had a place. She had a purpose. And for the first time, she felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the relentless pulse of the tower's construction. Winter slowly loosened its icy grip on the city, and with the thaw came a subtle but significant shift in the infirmary's atmosphere. The initial wariness of the men began to melt away, replaced by a grudging then genuine respect. Eleanor Vance was no longer the lady nurse. She was simply Doc, a title delivered without a trace of irony. Her reputation was built not on a single dramatic event, but on 100 small ones. It was built on the steady, competent way she cleaned a wound, the no-nonsense authority with which she diagnosed a fever, and the surprising gentleness she showed when a young worker came to her, homesick and lonely, with a letter from his family he couldn't read. She read it to him in the quiet of her office, her voice soft, offering him a small piece of home amidst the cold steel and concrete. Word of such things traveled fast through the tight-knit community of the worksite. The men learned her ways. They knew she had no tolerance for foolish risks, but endless patience for genuine need. They learned that the coffee pot in her small kitchen was always on, and that she could be counted on for a rational word of advice on anything from a sprained ankle to a troubled conscience. Mike O'Connell, the formidable foreman, became her staunchest ally. He began consulting her on safety protocols, asking her opinion on where to place warning signs and how to better secure scaffolding. "Doc sees things different," he'd grumble to his crew chiefs. "She sees where the blood's gonna spill before it happens." It was the highest compliment he could pay, but for Eleanor the most significant part of her new rhythm was the end of each day. Like clockwork, as the 5 o'clock whistle blew and the symphony of construction began to fade, Julian Croft would appear at her door. He called these visits his daily inspection, a formal review of the infirmary's logbook and a discussion of any incidents. But they both knew in a quiet, unspoken way that they had become something more. Their conversations were the anchor of Eleanor's day. They would sit in her small, neat office, a cup of her strong coffee in their hands and the vast skeletal tower growing outside the window. Initially, their talk was confined to work. She would report the day's injuries, a few cuts, a minor burn, a pulled muscle, and he would listen with that intense, unwavering focus of his, asking sharp, insightful questions. But gradually, the topics of their conversations began to stray. He would see a book on her desk, a collection of poetry by Edna St. Vincent Millay, and a discussion on iambic pentameter would ensue. He was surprised to find her knowledge of literature was as deep as her knowledge of medicine. She, in turn, was shocked to learn that this titan of industry had a passion for Italian opera and could debate the merits of Verdi versus Puccini with an academic's fervor. She began to see the man behind the imposing facade. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes that even his impeccable tailoring couldn't hide. She noticed the way he would trace the blueprints of the tower with his long, elegant fingers, a look of paternal pride on his face. He was not just building a structure, he was creating a legacy, and she was beginning to understand the immense weight of that ambition. For Julian, these end-of-day visits became a necessary ritual, a quiet port in the storm of his demanding life. His days were filled with combative board meetings, shouting matches with union leaders, and the constant crushing pressure of investors and deadlines. He lived in a world of numbers, contracts, and power plays. but for half an hour each evening, in the quiet, antiseptic-scented air of the infirmary, he found a different kind of order. He found Eleanor. He was captivated by her mind. She was logical, practical, and utterly devoid of the artifice and flattery that characterized most of the women in his social circle. She challenged his ideas, questioned his assumptions, and spoke to him not as a millionaire benefactor, but as an equal. Her presence was a balm to his restless, overburdened mind. He found himself lingering longer each day, manufacturing reasons to extend their conversations, reluctant to leave the small sanctuary she had created. One rainy afternoon in early March, he arrived to find her not in her office, but staring out the main clinic window at the tower, which was shrouded in a thick grey mist. "A penny for your thoughts, Miss Vance," he said softly, joining her at the window. "I was just thinking," she said without turning, "that it looks like a cathedral of steel, rising out of the fog." Julian smiled. "That's what my father called the Woolworth Building. He believed great architecture should inspire a sense of reverence." "He was right," Eleanor said. "It's easy to forget down here amidst the noise and the mud just how magnificent it is. What you're building." "What we're building," he corrected her gently. "Your work here keeping the men safe is as vital as any steel beam in its foundation." The simple inclusion in that single word, "we," sent a warm flutter through Eleanor's chest. She looked at him then and saw not just her employer but a partner in a grand endeavor. Their eyes held for a moment longer than usual, the professional space between them shrinking until it was filled with a silent, charged awareness. Breaking the spell, Julian cleared his throat. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Vance. Of a different sort this time." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "There is a lecture tomorrow evening at the New York Academy of Medicine," he explained, resuming his formal tone. "A Dr. Hemphill is speaking on new models of public health and urban planning, specifically concerning industrial work sites. He argues that a company's responsibility for its workers extends beyond the factory gates. I believe his ideas may be applicable here. I would be grateful if you would accompany me. Your practical experience would provide a valuable perspective on his theories." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. This was a significant step. He was asking her to join him outside the confines of the construction site in a world of academics and professionals. It was a clear, undeniable sign of his respect for her mind. "I would be honored, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice steady despite the sudden quickening of her pulse. The following evening, she was ready when his town car arrived. She had spent a precious portion of her salary on a new dress, a simple, elegant creation of dark green velvet that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. As she stepped into the car, Julian, who was waiting inside, seemed momentarily speechless. He was used to seeing her in her practical nurse's attire. Seeing her now, transformed, her natural grace enhanced by the simple elegance of the gown, was an unexpected revelation. "You look remarkable, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Thank you, Mr. Croft," she replied, a faint blush warming her cheeks. The lecture was fascinating, and their discussion on the ride back to her small apartment was even more so. They debated Dr. Hemphill's points with the easy familiarity of old colleagues, their minds perfectly in sync. The car moved silently through the rain-slicked streets, the lights of the city blurring into soft jewels of color through the windows. As they pulled up to her building, a comfortable silence fell between them. The professional part of the evening was over, leaving a quiet, intimate space in its wake. "Thank you for your company, Eleanor," Julian said, and the sound of her first name in his deep voice was both a shock and a caress. "Your insights were, as I suspected, invaluable." "The pleasure was all mine, Julian," she replied, testing his name on her tongue. It felt both foreign and perfectly right. Their hands were resting on the seat between them, inches apart. As he turned to face her more fully, the back of his hand brushed against hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of electricity through them both. They both froze, their eyes locking in the dim light of the car's interior. The world outside, the rain, the city, the hum of the engine, seemed to fade away. There was only the quiet space between them, charged with unspoken words and the palpable magnetic pull of two worlds colliding. He leaned forward almost imperceptibly, his gaze dropping to her lips. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it. The moment the slow, simmering burn was about to ignite into a flame, the air crackled with a tension that was both terrifying and thrilling. A line was about to be crossed, and neither of them was certain they wanted to stop it. The space between them in the back of the Rolls-Royce had become a universe unto itself. The city, with its rain-slicked streets and blurred, glittering lights, had ceased to exist. There was only the scent of damp wool and Eleanor's faint, clean fragrance, the sound of their own breathing, and the magnetic pull that drew Julian inexorably forward. His hand, which had brushed against hers, now covered it completely, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. His gaze was fixed on her lips, and she felt a dizzying, weightless sensation, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for this single, inevitable moment. But just as the gap between them was about to close, a sudden, jarring blast of a ship's horn from the nearby East River cut through the night, a mournful, guttural cry that shattered the spell. It was a harsh reminder of the world outside their warm, private cocoon. Eleanor flinched, the sound pulling her back to reality. She gently withdrew her hand from under his, the loss of his touch leaving her skin feeling strangely cold. She saw a flicker of something in Julian's eyes, disappointment perhaps, mingled with a flicker of self-reproach. He leaned back into his seat, the invisible line of propriety reforming between them, thicker and more charged than before. "Forgive me, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low murmur, husky with an emotion he quickly suppressed. "That was unprofessional." "There is nothing to forgive, Julian," she replied, her own voice steadier than she felt. She smoothed down the velvet of her dress, a nervous gesture. "It has been a long evening." The rest of the short drive was conducted in a thick, profound silence. It was not an awkward silence, but one filled with the weight of what had almost happened, of what they both now knew was simmering just beneath the surface of their carefully constructed professional relationship. When the car stopped in front of her modest apartment building, he did not move to get out. "Thank you again for the evening," she said, her hand on the door handle. "The honor was mine," he replied formally, though his eyes told a different story. They held a new warmth, a new depth. He was no longer looking at his employee. He was looking at the woman he had almost kissed, the woman who occupied his thoughts far more than any blueprint or business deal. "I will see you at the site tomorrow, Miss Vance." The return to her formal title was deliberate, a necessary retreat to safe ground. "Of course, Mr. Croft," she answered in kind. As she walked up the steps to her building, she could feel his eyes on her. She did not look back. To do so would be to acknowledge the torrent of emotion that the almost kiss had unleashed within her, and she was not yet ready to face it. The next morning, the air at the construction site was crisp and clear. The rain had washed the city clean, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. A sense of renewed energy buzzed through the workers. They were making incredible progress. The steel skeleton of the Croft Tower had now reached the 50th floor, a staggering achievement that was the talk of the town. The mood was optimistic, almost festive. Eleanor felt the change in atmosphere as soon as she arrived. The men greeted her with easy familiarity. "Morning, Doc," they'd call out, tipping their hats. She had become a fixture, a part of the complex machinery of the site. She spent the morning tending to the usual minor injuries, a splinter here, a bruised thumb there, and updating her meticulous records. Julian did not make his usual morning visit. Eleanor told herself it was for the best. They both needed space to let the charged energy of the previous night dissipate. Yet, she couldn't deny the pang of disappointment she felt. His daily visits had become the fulcrum around which her day pivoted. It was shortly after noon, when the men had broken for lunch, that the world came to an end. It began with a sound, not a loud, explosive bang, but a deep, groaning, metallic shriek, like the sound of a giant beast in agony. It was a sound that was fundamentally wrong, a violation of the natural order of the site. Every man froze, their heads snapping upwards. Then came the sight. High above, on the southwest corner of the 50th floor, a massive section of newly laid steel beams began to buckle. A critical joint, improperly secured, had failed under the immense weight. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, the structure seemed to hang in the air, defying gravity. Then, with a final sickening tear of metal, it gave way. Tons of steel, rivets, and wooden scaffolding began to fall. It was not a clean drop. It was a cascading, chaotic avalanche, a waterfall of destruction that tore through the lower levels as it descended. Beams struck other beams, shearing them from their moorings. The carefully constructed grid of the tower's edge disintegrated, creating a domino effect of catastrophic failure. A collective, primal roar of horror and disbelief rose from the men on the ground. Those who were in the path of the falling debris scattered, running for their lives. The crash when the debris hit the ground was a thunderous, earth-shaking impact that sent a shockwave across the entire site. It was followed by a terrible, unnatural silence, which was then pierced by the first screams of the injured. Eleanor had been in her office reviewing inventory lists. The initial terrible groan of the metal had sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her. She was outside the infirmary door before the first beam had even hit the ground, her mind already racing, her training kicking in with a cold, clear precision that superseded all emotion. The scene before her was one of utter devastation. A massive pile of twisted steel and splintered wood lay in a heap, crushing a section of the ground-level workshops. A thick cloud of dust and grit filled the air, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. Men were running everywhere, some away from the danger, some towards it, shouting names, their faces masks of terror and confusion. And from within the wreckage, the cries of the trapped and wounded were a horrifying chorus. In that moment of chaos, Eleanor Vance became a general. Her voice, clear and sharp, cut through the panic. "O'Connell," she yelled, spotting the foreman standing frozen, his face ashen with shock. "Mike, I need you!" Her shout seemed to break his paralysis. He ran to her side. "Doc, my God." "There's no time for that," she snapped, her eyes scanning the disaster zone, her mind making 1,000 calculations a second. "I need order. I need help. Get me 20 men with steady hands and strong stomachs. Now. And get me every lantern you can find. We're going in there." She turned to another group of stunned workers. "You, clear a path. I need a triage area here outside the infirmary. And I need clean water, every barrel you can find. Go." Her authority was absolute, her commands so clear and logical that the panicked men latched onto them as a lifeline. They began to move, their fear channeled into purposeful action. Julian had been in a meeting in his on-site office, a temporary structure 100 yards from the tower's base when the disaster struck. He felt the impact through the floorboards, a deep, sickening thud that he knew in his bones was a structural failure. He was outside in seconds, his heart pounding with a cold, terrible dread. He saw the mangled section of his tower, his beautiful cathedral, torn open like a wound. He saw the chaos, the dust, the fear. His first instinct was to run towards the wreckage, to assess the damage to his creation. But then he saw her. He saw Eleanor standing at the edge of the disaster zone, a small, determined figure in a world of chaos, her voice ringing out, organizing his terrified men into rescue teams. She was not panicking. She was commanding. She had transformed the infirmary grounds into an impromptu field hospital. He watched, mesmerized as she worked. She had her 20 men now, and she was directing them with the precision of a field marshal. "You four, that section there. Use the crowbars to lift, not to pull. We need to stabilize it. You two, with me." She tied a clean kerchief over her nose and mouth, and without a moment's hesitation, plunged into the dangerous, unstable wreckage herself, her medical bag in hand. Julian's heart stopped. He started to run towards her, an instinct to protect her overriding everything else. "Mr. Croft, sir, stay back," O'Connell yelled, grabbing his arm. "It ain't stable. Doc's orders." Julian stopped, frozen, as he watched her disappear into the twisted metal. He felt a profound, gut-wrenching sense of helplessness. He was the master of this universe, the titan of industry, the man whose vision this all was. But in this moment, he was useless. His knowledge of stress points and load-bearing capacities was worthless. The only thing that mattered now was saving the lives of his men, and that power belonged entirely to the woman he had rescued from a street corner. For the next hour, Eleanor was a force of nature. Inside the wreckage, She moved with a fearless, focused grace. She triaged men on the spot, her hands moving swiftly, assessing injuries, deciding who needed immediate attention and who could wait. She performed emergency procedures in the cramped, dusty darkness, using lanterns held by trembling workers for light. She staunched bleeding with torn strips of men's shirts. She splinted a shattered leg using a piece of splintered 2x4 and a man's own belt. She crawled into a tiny, crushed space to reach a trapped worker, comforting him in a low, steady voice, while the men worked frantically to free him. Her calm was infectious. Her authority was unquestionable. The men, who had been on the verge of a full-blown panic, now worked with a grim, focused determination, following her every command without question. Julian watched from the perimeter, a silent, tormented observer. He saw them carry the first of the wounded out, and saw Eleanor directing their placement in the triage area she had established. He saw her moving from man to man, her face smudged with grease and dirt, her dress torn at the hem, her expression one of absolute, unwavering concentration. She was magnificent. She was terrifyingly beautiful. He had admired her intelligence, been charmed by her spirit, and felt a powerful physical attraction to her. But what he felt now was something else entirely. It was awe. A profound, soul-shaking awe for her courage, her strength, her grace under unimaginable pressure. He was watching a hero at work. He finally saw his own role. He began to organize the uninjured men, sending them for blankets, for more water, for anything Eleanor's teams might need. He cleared a path for the ambulances that had begun to arrive, his authoritative voice cutting through the noise, bringing a larger sense of order to the chaos. He was working in service to her command, a titan taking orders from his nurse. Late in the afternoon, as the last of the seriously injured men was pulled from the wreckage, Eleanor finally emerged. She was covered in dust and grime, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were clear and bright. She surveyed the scene, the rows of injured men being tended to, the organized chaos that had replaced the initial panic, and gave a small, weary nod of satisfaction. She saw Julian then, and their eyes met across the disaster zone. The world fell away again, but this time it was not with the tension of an almost kiss. It was with the silent, profound understanding of a shared, terrible ordeal. He walked towards her, his long strides eating up the distance between them. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, his hand gently brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. His touch was tender, reverent. In that single, simple gesture, all the unspoken emotions of the past weeks, the admiration, the attraction, the respect, coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. He loved her. It was a love born not in a quiet, romantic moment, but here in the heart of a disaster, forged in the crucible of her incredible strength. He knew with a certainty that shook him to his very core that he could not, would not, live his life without this woman. The line between them had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated by the falling sky. The simple act of Julian's touch, his fingers gently brushing the grime from her cheek, was an anchor in the swirling sea of exhaustion that threatened to pull Eleanor under. For hours, she had been running on pure, undiluted adrenaline, her mind a sharp, crystalline instrument of medical focus. Now, as the last ambulance wailed its mournful siren into the distance and a semblance of grim order settled over the site, the immense weight of the day began to crash down upon her. Her knees felt weak, and the world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Julian's hand moved from her cheek to her elbow, his grip firm and steadying, as if he could sense her impending collapse. "You need to rest, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. He was no longer looking at her as an employee, but as something infinitely more precious, something fragile that had proven itself to be unbreakable. Before she could protest, Mike O'Connell approached them, his hard-bitten face streaked with dirt, his eyes red-rimmed with fatigue and unshed tears. He stopped before Eleanor, his massive frame seeming to bow slightly. He removed his dusty hat, clutching it in his hands in a gesture of profound respect. "Doc," he began, his gravelly voice thick with emotion. He had to clear his throat before he could continue. The men, they wanted me to thank you. What you did today, You saved them. You saved my boys. We won't ever forget it." From behind him, a small crowd of the uninjured workers had gathered. They stood in silence, their faces weary but filled with a raw, unvarnished gratitude. One by one, they nodded at her, their expressions conveying what words could not. In the space of a single afternoon, she had become their hero. The invisible wall that had separated her from them, the wall of gender and class, had been torn down as surely as the scaffolding had been. She was one of them now. Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes, blurring the scene before her. "I was just doing my job, Mike," she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time that day. "No, miss," O'Connell said, shaking his head. "That wasn't a job. That was a miracle." Julian watched this exchange, a quiet, unreadable expression on his face. He saw the genuine, heartfelt reverence of his men for this woman. He saw the way they looked at her as their protector, their champion. And he knew that what he felt for her was mirrored in the hearts of every man on his payroll. "O'Connell," Julian said, his voice regaining its familiar tone of command, "I am taking Miss Vance home. You are in charge until I return tomorrow morning. See to it the site is secured and that the families of the injured are properly notified. A full list of their conditions will be sent to you from the hospitals." "Yes, sir, Mr. Croft," the foreman said without hesitation. Julian turned back to Eleanor. "Come," he said gently. "It's over." He led her towards his town car, which sat waiting like a sleek black hearse at the edge of the chaos. He dismissed his driver, Patrick, with a quiet word. "I'll drive Miss Vance myself. See to your own family." He opened the passenger door for her, a gesture of old-world courtesy that felt strangely intimate in the gritty, devastated landscape. As Eleanor sank into the plush leather seat, a deep, bone-deep weariness washed over her. The adrenaline had finally run its course, leaving behind a hollow ache of emotional and physical exhaustion. Julian slid into the driver's seat, the powerful engine purring to life with a quiet rumble that was a stark contrast to the day's violent noises. He navigated the car away from the site, away from the twisted steel and the ghosts of the day's tragedy. They drove in silence for several blocks, the rhythmic swish of the tires on the pavement the only sound. Eleanor stared out the window, but she didn't see the city. She saw flashes of the afternoon, the terrified face of a young man trapped under a beam, the glint of her own surgical needle in the lantern light, the dark, spreading stain of blood on a man's shirt. She had compartmentalized it all to function, but now the images were flooding back, threatening to overwhelm her. "Are you all right?" Julian asked, his voice breaking the silence. She shook her head, unable to form words. A single hot tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Julian pulled the car over to the curb, stopping in the shadow of a quiet, tree-lined street. He turned in his seat to face her. The setting sun cast long shadows inside the car, illuminating the exhaustion on her face and the deep, profound emotion in his eyes. "I have spent my life building things, Eleanor," he began, his voice low and intense. "I have built with steel, with stone, with numbers on a ledger. I have always believed that strength was in the design, in the materials, in the sheer force of will it takes to raise something from the ground. I was wrong." He reached across the space between them, his hand covering hers where it lay limply in her lap. His touch was warm and firm. "Today, I saw what real strength is. It isn't in steel beams or financial power. It's in a steady hand when the world is shaking apart. It's in a calm voice when everyone else is screaming. It's in the courage to run toward danger, not away from it. I saw you today, and I understood." He took a deep breath as if the words he was about to say were the heaviest things he had ever lifted. "I have admired your mind. I have been captivated by your spirit. But after what I witnessed today, I know that I am in love with you. It is a love born of the most profound respect and awe a man can feel. I love your courage, your compassion, your incredible, unshakable strength. I love you." His confession hung in the air, simple, direct, and utterly devastating in its sincerity. The carefully constructed walls around Eleanor's own heart, walls she had built to protect herself from a world that had proven to be cruel and unjust, crumbled into dust. She had also seen him today, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as a man who had set aside his own power to support her, a man who had trusted her completely, a man whose eyes had followed her with a mixture of terror and reverence. "Julian," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Today, when I was in the wreckage, I wasn't afraid. Not really. Because I knew you were out there. I knew you were organizing, helping, making sure I could do my work. I felt safe. In the middle of all that horror, you made me feel safe. I think," she said, her eyes meeting his, "I have been falling in love with you since the moment you wrapped your coat around me at the train station." A slow, wondrous smile spread across Julian's face, transforming his usually severe features. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. He leaned forward, framing her face with his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice husky. And then he kissed her. It was not the tentative, questioning kiss that had almost happened the night before. This was a kiss of absolute certainty. It was tender with gratitude, fierce with the pent-up emotions of the day, and deep with the profound recognition of two souls who had finally found their counterpart. It was a kiss that sealed a vow amidst the wreckage, a promise of a new beginning. When they finally broke apart, breathless, they simply looked at each other, their foreheads resting together. The world outside, the past, the future, none of it mattered. There was only this moment, this perfect, unshakable truth between them. "I cannot go back to the way things were," Julian said, his voice barely a whisper. "I cannot go back to my empty house, to my solitary life, knowing that you exist, knowing what it feels like to have you as a partner." He pulled back slightly, his grey eyes intense, serious, and full of a love so powerful it took her breath away. "This is madness," he said with a small, self-deprecating laugh. "It is too soon. It is complicated. It defies all logic and convention. But I don't care. Marry me, Eleanor. Be my wife. Be my partner in building not just towers, but a life. Say you'll marry me." It was not a question born of romantic fancy, but of visceral necessity. He was a man who had just witnessed the potential collapse of his life's work and had realized in the same moment what his life was truly for. Eleanor looked at this incredible, brilliant, honorable man, and her answer was as simple and certain as the beating of her own heart. "Yes," she whispered, a radiant smile breaking through her tears. "Yes, Julian, I'll marry you." The world, for a brief magical interlude, consisted only of the two of them, cocooned in the luxurious intimacy of the Rolls-Royce. The city, with its scars and its sorrows, faded into a distant murmur. Julian's proposal, so raw and spontaneous, hung in the air between them, a promise that was as solid and real as the magnificent diamond ring he would later place on her finger. Eleanor's yes had been a whisper, yet it had resounded in the small space with the force of a tectonic shift, forever altering the landscape of their lives. Julian did not take her back to her small, lonely apartment. To do so would have felt like a retreat, a negation of the monumental step they had just taken. Instead, he drove through the awakening city, towards the grand, imposing mansions that lined Fifth Avenue. He drove towards his home. The Croft mansion was a fortress of limestone and marble, a testament to 3 generations of immense wealth and unshakable power. It was a place Eleanor had only ever seen in newspaper photographs, a symbol of a world so far removed from her own, it might as well have been on another planet. As Julian led her up the grand, sweeping staircase, her hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm, she felt a tremor of apprehension. This was his world, his history. Could it ever be hers? He led her not to a guest room, but to his own private wing, a suite of rooms decorated in rich mahoganies and deep, calming blues. A fire was already roaring in the hearth, lit by a silent, efficient servant who had appeared and vanished like a ghost. "You should rest," Julian said, his voice soft as he gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "Properly. We can talk about everything in the morning." Despite the exhaustion that weighed on her like a physical shroud, sleep did not come easily. She lay in the magnificent guest bed, the silk sheets cool against her skin, and felt a dizzying sense of dislocation. Less than a week ago, she had been facing the prospect of freezing to death on a street corner. Now she was the fiancée of one of the most powerful men in New York, lying in a bed that probably cost more than she had ever earned in her entire life. It was a fairy tale, but even in fairy tales there were dragons to be slain, and she had a feeling she was about to meet one. Her premonition proved correct the next morning. Julian had insisted she take the day to rest and recover, providing her with a selection of books and a quiet breakfast served in her suite. He, however, had a duty to perform, a battle to face. He had to tell his mother. Beatrice Croft was the undisputed queen of New York high society. She was a woman of formidable intelligence and even more formidable will, a matriarch who had guarded the Croft family's name and fortune with the ferocity of a lioness protecting her cubs. She believed in order, tradition, and the sacred importance of bloodlines. Her world was a carefully curated collection of the right people, the right schools, the right marriages. An alliance for the Crofts was not a matter of the heart. It was a merger. Julian found her in the morning room, a sun-drenched space filled with priceless French furniture and portraits of stern-faced Croft ancestors. She sat at her writing desk, composing letters on thick, cream-colored stationery, her posture ramrod straight. "Julian, darling," she said without looking up, "I read about the dreadful accident at the construction site, a tragedy. I trust you have the situation well in hand." Her voice was like polished ice, elegant and cold. "I do, Mother," Julian said, closing the door behind him. "The men are being cared for, the site is secure." "Good," she said, finally placing her pen down and turning to face him. Her eyes, the same shade of clear grey as his, were sharp and missed nothing. "There is, however, the matter of the press. This sort of incident reflects poorly on the family name. We must ensure the narrative is properly managed." "The narrative that I am concerned with today is a different one," Julian said, his tone quiet but firm. He stood before her desk, not as a son, but as a man who had come to state an unalterable fact. "I am going to be married." Beatrice's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Oh? Has Caroline Vanderbilt finally accepted your advances? An excellent match. Her father's shipping interests would align perfectly with our own." "I am not marrying Caroline Vanderbilt," Julian said. "I am marrying Eleanor Vance." The name hung in the air between them. Beatrice's expression did not change, but a dangerous stillness settled over her. "Vance?" she repeated, testing the unfamiliar name. "I don't believe I know any Vances of significance. From Boston, perhaps?" "From the Lower East Side by way of a Philadelphia charity hospital," Julian stated, his voice devoid of apology. "She is the nurse I hired to run the infirmary at the tower." For a long moment Beatrice was utterly silent. She simply stared at him, her grey eyes turning to chips of ice. When she finally spoke, her voice was dangerously soft. "I see," she said. "You have taken leave of your senses." "On the contrary," Julian countered, "I have never seen things more clearly. You are the head of this family, Julian. You have a duty, a responsibility to our name, to our legacy. You cannot, you will not, throw it all away for some nameless, penniless waif you picked up off the street. I forbid it." "You are not in a position to forbid me anything," Julian said, his own voice hardening. "I am not a boy to be scolded. I am a man informing you of the woman who will be my wife." Beatrice rose from her chair, her movements fluid and predatory. She paced the room, her silk gown whispering across the Persian rug. "Think of the scandal, Julian. Think of the whispers, the mockery. Julian Croft and his charity case. It will make us a laughingstock. This girl, what could she possibly know of our world, of the duties she would be expected to perform as your wife? She will be a constant embarrassment." "She is the most honorable, intelligent, and courageous woman I have ever met," Julian said, his voice ringing with a conviction that was absolute. "Yesterday, while your friends were planning their next gala, she was crawling through the wreckage of my collapsed tower, saving the lives of my men. She has more character in her little finger than your entire social circle has in their collective fortunes. She is not an embarrassment. She is my salvation." "How very dramatic," Beatrice sneered, her mask of civility finally cracking. "You are infatuated. It's a passing fancy, a dalliance with the lower classes. I will not allow it to destroy everything our family has built. If you persist in this foolishness, you will do it alone. I will see to it that every door in this city is closed to you. You will be an outcast. Then I will be an outcast, Julian said simply. I will not abandon her. She is my future. We shall see, Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. This little nurse of yours. She may have courage on a construction site, but this world, our world, it has its own ways of crushing those who do not belong. She will not survive it. I will make certain of it. Later that day, Julian told Eleanor everything. He sat with her in the library, a vast two-story room filled with the comforting scent of leather and old paper, and recounted the conversation with his mother. He did not soften the words, nor did he hide the depth of his mother's opposition. As Eleanor listened, a cold dread settled in her stomach. She had faced down poverty, scandal, and disaster, but this was a different kind of enemy. This was a war to be fought in whispers, with glances and social slights as weapons, a war of exclusion designed to make her feel small, insignificant, and unworthy. Perhaps she is right, Julian, Eleanor said quietly, her gaze fixed on her hands, which were twisting in her lap. I don't know anything about your world. I would not know what to say, how to act. I would only cause you shame. Julian moved from his chair to kneel before her. He took her trembling hands in his. Eleanor, look at me. He waited until her frightened eyes met his. The only shame I could ever feel would be in letting my mother's prejudice dictate my life. I do not want you to be like them. I love you precisely because you are not. You are real. You are true. Their world is a cage of gilded hypocrisy. Our world, the one we will build together, will be built on the work we do, the lives we touch, and the love we share. That is the only society I care to belong to. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the spark of the fighter he knew she was. We will face this together, he said. I will not let her hurt you. She wanted to believe him. But as she looked past his shoulder at the portraits of the stern, formidable Croft ancestors lining the walls, she knew that this would be the greatest test of all. The disaster at the tower had been swift and tangible. This would be a slow, insidious siege on her heart and her spirit. The Lioness of Fifth Avenue had declared war, and Eleanor knew with a chilling certainty that the battle had only just begun. Com certeza. A guerra foi declarada, não com canhões, mas com o silêncio gelado da alta sociedade. A força do amor de Julian e Eleanor está prestes a ser testada no mais público e implacável dos campos de batalha, um salão de festas de Manhattan. Aqui está o capítulo 8 de The Industrialist and the Penniless Nurse, a Roaring Twenties love story that defied an era. Chapter 8. The Lion's Den. The weeks following Julian's confrontation with his mother were a masterclass in the subtle cruelties of the upper class. Beatrice Croft's war was not one of open hostility, but of 1,000 tiny, expertly placed cuts. It was a war of whispers, of silence, of exclusion, so perfectly executed, it was almost invisible to the naked eye. Invitations to dinner parties and charity luncheons, which had previously flooded Julian's desk, slowed to a trickle, and those that did arrive were addressed to Mr. Julian Croft alone. When Julian would call to amend the invitation, he would be met with a flurry of polite, flimsy excuses from the hostess. Oh dear, I'm afraid the seating is already set. Another time, perhaps. There was never another time. When they dared to venture out, to a restaurant or the theater, a chill would seem to follow them. Acquaintances of Julian's, who would normally greet him with hearty handshakes, would offer only a stiff, formal nod, their eyes sliding past Eleanor as if she were a piece of furniture. Conversations would hush as they approached, only to resume in conspiratorial whispers as they passed. Eleanor learned to feel the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on her back, dissecting her dress, her posture, her very existence in their world. It was a slow, insidious siege, designed to make her feel like an intruder, a ghost at the feast. There were moments late at night when the doubts would creep in. She would lie awake in the opulent guest suite of the Croft mansion, the silence of the great house pressing in on her, and wonder if she was strong enough for this. She had faced down poverty and disaster, but this quiet, relentless judgment felt like being eroded, grain by grain. Yet, through it all, Julian was her unwavering shield. He seemed to possess a sixth sense for the impending slights. If a society matron turned her back on Eleanor, Julian would gently but firmly steer their conversation in that direction, forcing an introduction that could not be refused without open rudeness. If a host failed to acknowledge her, Julian would make her the center of his attention, his pride in her evident in every glance, every touch of his hand on the small of her back. He never apologized for the behavior of his peers. To do so would be to validate it. Instead, he simply made it clear in 100 unspoken ways that he and Eleanor were a single, unassailable unit. An insult to her was a direct affront to him, and there were few in New York willing to openly challenge the master of the Croft Empire. Their bond, forged in the heat of disaster, was now being tempered in the ice of social warfare. They found their sanctuary within the walls of the mansion, in the quiet of the library or at the construction site, which had become a surprising refuge. There, amongst the noise and the grit, Eleanor was not a social climber. She was Doc, a respected figure of authority and compassion. The stark contrast between the genuine respect of the working men and the veiled contempt of the city's elite was not lost on her. One evening, as they sat before the fire in the library, Eleanor finally gave voice to the fears that haunted her. "Julian," she said softly, "are you sure about this? About me? Your mother was right. I don't belong in this world. I am costing you your friends, your social standing." Julian put down his book and turned to her, his expression serious. He took her hands in his. "Eleanor, when my father died, he left me with two things, a vast fortune and a piece of advice. He told me, 'Wealth is a tool, not a destination. Use it to build things that matter.' For years, I thought he meant buildings. I have been so focused on my tower, on my legacy of steel and stone, that I nearly missed the point." He squeezed her hands. "What matters is not the society of people who value a name more than a character. What matters is building a life of purpose. You, with your courage, your brilliance, your unwavering compassion, you are what matters. You are the most important thing I will ever build. Do you understand? You are not costing me anything. You are showing me what is truly valuable." His words were a balm to her bruised spirit. She looked into his eyes and saw no doubt, no regret, only a deep, abiding love and an unshakable faith in her. In that moment, her resolve hardened. She would not let Beatrice Croft or anyone else break her. She would not be the penniless nurse. She was Eleanor Vance, and she would be Julian Croft's wife. The final battlefield was chosen by Beatrice herself. The annual Metropolitan Benefactors Gala was the crown jewel of the New York social season, an event where fortunes were pledged, alliances were forged, and reputations were made or broken. The Croft family was a primary patron, and Julian's attendance was not optional. Beatrice sent a note to Julian, its message brief and chillingly clear. "We expect to see you and your fiancé." It is time she was formally introduced. It was a gauntlet being thrown down. The gala would be the ultimate test, a public trial where every gossip columnist and society dragon would be in attendance, waiting to pass judgment. "She means to make a spectacle of me," Eleanor said quietly, as she read the note over Julian's shoulder. "Yes," Julian agreed, his jaw tight. "She believes she can intimidate you into retreat. She believes you will falter under the pressure." "And what do you believe?" Eleanor asked, meeting his gaze. A slow smile touched Julian's lips. "I believe," he said, "that my mother has severely underestimated her opponent." The days leading up to the gala were like preparing for a campaign. Julian, with the strategic mind of a general, briefed her on the key players. He described the alliances and rivalries, the hidden scandals and the unspoken power dynamics of the city's elite. "Think of it as a different kind of construction site," he told her, "full of precarious structures and hidden dangers." Eleanor, for her part, prepared with the diligence of a scholar. She read the society pages, memorizing names and faces. She was not preparing to impress them, but to understand them. She would not be caught off guard. The day of the gala arrived. As evening fell, a quiet tension settled over the Croft mansion. Julian stood by the fireplace in his library, impeccably dressed in a black tailcoat, waiting. When Eleanor appeared in the doorway, he fell silent. She had chosen her armor with care. It was a gown of deep midnight blue satin, a color that spoke of quiet confidence, not girlish frivolity. The dress was a masterpiece of simple, elegant lines, its only adornment a delicate string of pearls, a gift from Julian, that rested against her collarbone. Her hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, revealing the graceful line of her neck. She looked beautiful, yes, but more than that, she looked formidable. She looked like a queen. Julian walked towards her, his eyes filled with an emotion so intense it made her heart ache. He took her hands in his. They were cold. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Eleanor took a deep breath, her gaze steady and clear. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce protective love for the man standing before her and a newfound, unshakable belief in herself. She was no longer the freezing, desperate girl on the street corner. She was the woman who had stared down death and disaster, the woman who had earned the respect of hardened men, the woman who had won the love of Julian Croft. "I'm ready," she said, her voice not a whisper, but a statement of fact. He smiled, a look of immense pride on his face. He offered her his arm. "Then let's not keep them waiting." Together they walked down the grand staircase and out into the cold night air, leaving the sanctuary of their home behind. They were heading into the lion's den, but this time the lioness of Fifth Avenue would find that her prey was not a frightened lamb, but a lioness in her own right. The battle was about to begin. The grand ballroom of the Astor Hotel was not merely a room, it was a statement of power. It was a cavern of shimmering gold leaf, crystal, and marble, where the combined wealth of New York City was gathered under the light of a dozen colossal chandeliers. The air hummed with the murmur of 1,000 conversations, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the lush strains of a live orchestra playing the latest Cole Porter tune. This was the beating heart of high society, and tonight it was a lion's den. As Julian and Eleanor stepped through the grand archway, a palpable change rippled through the room. It was not a sudden silence, but a subtle dip in the ambient noise, a collective, almost unconscious intake of breath. Conversations faltered. Heads turned, eyes sharp and hungry for scandal fixed upon them. They were not merely arriving, they were making an entrance, and every person in the room understood the drama that was about to unfold. Eleanor felt a jolt of pure, cold fear. Her hand tightened on Julian's arm, her knuckles white. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, a small secret signal of solidarity. He did not falter, his stride as calm and confident as if he were walking into his own library. He moved through the sea of staring faces, his head held high, a king entering his court with his chosen queen at his side. The gauntlet began immediately. A prominent banker and his wife, who had hosted Julian for dinner just months before, suddenly found the floral centerpiece fascinating as they approached. A famously garrulous senator offered Julian a curt nod, but kept his back squarely turned to Eleanor. It was a masterclass in social assassination, 100 small coordinated movements designed to render her invisible. But Eleanor did not shrink. She drew strength from Julian's unwavering composure and from the memory of who she was. She was not the frightened girl from the street corner. She was the woman who had faced down death in the wreckage of his tower. She met the cold stares with a quiet, dignified gaze of her own, her posture regal, her expression serene. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. They finally came to the epicenter of the room's power structure. There, seated on a velvet divan and surrounded by a coterie of her most influential friends, was Beatrice Croft. She looked magnificent, a queen upon her throne, dressed in shimmering silver silk and ablaze with the famous Croft diamonds. She watched their approach, her face a perfect, placid mask. "Julian," she said, her voice carrying clearly, a sliver of ice. "How good of you to finally join us." She extended a hand, not to be shaken but to be kissed, a gesture of feudal authority. Julian brushed his lips against her gloved knuckles. "Mother." Beatrice's cold grey eyes then settled on Eleanor. She looked her up and down, a slow, dismissive appraisal that lasted only a moment but felt like an eternity. "And this must be the nurse," she said, the word nurse imbued with a delicate, dismissive condescension. "Miss Vance, is it?" "It is," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "How brave of you to come," Beatrice continued, a faint, cruel smile playing on her lips. She turned to the woman beside her, a notoriously sharp-tongued gossip columnist named Mrs. Albright. "We were just discussing the new wing of the Children's Hospital, funded so generously by the Vanderbilt family. Such important work." "Tell me, Miss Vance," she said, turning her full, chilling attention back to Eleanor. "What charitable causes does one support in your part of town? I imagine the needs are quite overwhelming." The insult was as sharp and as perfectly placed as a surgeon's scalpel. It was designed to publicly frame Eleanor as a charity case herself, a creature of poverty, with no understanding of their world of grand philanthropy. The women around Beatrice smiled thin, predatory smiles, waiting for the kill. Eleanor felt a flush of anger, but she met Beatrice's gaze without flinching. Before she could formulate a reply, Julian stepped forward slightly, placing himself protectively in front of her. "Eleanor's cause, Mother," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "is the belief that a person's life is worth saving, regardless of their social standing. It is a cause she supports not with checks written from an inheritance, but with her own two hands, her own courage, and her own brilliant mind." A tense silence fell over the group. At that moment, a chime sounded, calling the guests to their tables for dinner and the evening speeches. Julian took Eleanor's arm. "If you will excuse us," he said, giving his mother a look of cold finality. "We have a table." The dinner was an ordeal of polite conversation and exquisite food that tasted like ash in Eleanor's mouth. She was seated between Julian and an elderly deaf industrialist, effectively isolated, but she endured. She knew this was merely the prelude. The main event was yet to come. After dessert, the master of ceremonies took to the stage to introduce the evening's keynote speaker, Mr. Julian Croft. As Julian made his way to the podium, a polite but strained applause filled the room. All eyes were on him, a mixture of curiosity and morbid anticipation. He stood at the podium, a tall, commanding figure under the bright lights. He looked out over the sea of faces, his gaze calm and steady. "Good evening," he began, his voice resonating through the hall. "We are here tonight to celebrate the spirit of philanthropy, the act of building a better city for all its inhabitants. We write checks, we endow wings, we put our family names on buildings of brick and stone, and that is important work." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But I have recently been reminded that the most important structures are not made of brick and stone. They are made of people. The true test of a city is not the height of its towers, but the strength of its character. And the true meaning of charity is not in the giving of wealth, but in the giving of oneself." He let the words hang in the air. The room was utterly silent now. "As many of you know," he continued, "my company suffered a terrible accident a few months ago, a disaster that cost several men their lives and injured dozens more. In that moment of chaos and terror, my fortune was worthless. My power was meaningless. My blueprints were just pieces of paper. The only thing that mattered was courage. The only thing of value was skill." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more intimate, compelling tone. "In the midst of that horror, one person stood fast. One person ran toward the danger when everyone else was running away. One person, with no thought for their own safety, crawled into the unstable wreckage to splint shattered bones and comfort the dying. One person organized a rescue effort with the clarity of a field general and worked for hours, saving life after life, with nothing but a small leather bag and an unbreakable will. That person, ladies and gentlemen, is the greatest builder I have ever known." He lifted his gaze, his eyes searching the room until they found Eleanor. He smiled. "That person is also my fiancée, Miss Eleanor Vance." A collective gasp went through the ballroom. He had done it. He had taken Beatrice's carefully constructed narrative and shattered it with a single powerful story. "Please join me on stage, Eleanor," he said, extending a hand to her. As if in a dream, Eleanor stood and walked towards the stage. The whispers that followed her now were not of scorn, but of awe. The eyes that watched her were no longer cold, but filled with a new, dawning respect. She took his outstretched hand, and he pulled her up to stand beside him at the podium. He turned back to the audience, his arms securely around her waist. "My family's foundation has for decades built hospitals. Tonight, I am announcing a new direction. Guided by Eleanor's vision and first-hand experience, the Croft Foundation will now dedicate itself to establishing a network of free community-based clinics throughout the city's most underserved neighborhoods. It will be a legacy based not on grand buildings bearing our name, but on the simple, radical idea that quality healthcare is a right, not a privilege. This will be Eleanor's work. This will be our work." He then looked directly at his mother, who sat frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and defeated fury. "This," he said, his voice ringing with finality, "is the future of the Croft legacy." He then turned to Eleanor, and in front of the most powerful people in New York, he leaned down and kissed her, a tender public declaration of his love and devotion. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then, from a table near the front, a single person began to clap. It was the elderly, deaf industrialist who had sat beside Eleanor at dinner. Others joined in, hesitantly at first and then with growing enthusiasm, until the entire ballroom erupted in a thunderous, sustained wave of applause. It was for her courage. It was for his devotion. It was for the beautiful, undeniable truth of their story. Eleanor stood beside Julian, her hand in his, the warmth of the stage lights on her face, the sound of the ovation washing over her. She looked out at the sea of faces and saw not enemies, but witnesses. The war was over. The battle had been won, and she had not merely survived, she had triumphed. Leaving the Astor Hotel that night was like emerging from a dream. The chilly night air felt clean and sharp against their faces, a welcome antidote to the overheated, rarefied atmosphere of the ballroom. The thunderous applause still seemed to echo in their ears, a verdict delivered by a jury of their peers, acquitting them of all social crimes and celebrating their union. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the Rolls-Royce, Julian took Eleanor's hand. His was warm and steady. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, profound pride. "You faced down the entire city without flinching." "We faced them down," Eleanor corrected him softly, turning her hand to intertwine her fingers with his. "You gave me the courage. You gave them the truth. You," he insisted, "are the truth." There was no need for more words. They drove through the glittering, sleeping city, their shared silence more intimate than any conversation. They had walked into the lion's den and emerged not just unscathed, but victorious. Beatrice Croft had been silenced, her power broken by the one thing she could not fight, a genuine, unassailable love story. Their wedding 3 months later was not the grand society event the city's gossip columnists breathlessly anticipated. It was something far more meaningful. On a bright, clear morning in early summer, they stood not in the cavernous nave of St. Patrick's Cathedral, but in the sun-drenched main reading room of the newly refurbished Chatham Square Library. The little library, saved from extinction by Julian's first act of faith in Eleanor, had been reborn. Its floors were polished, its walls were freshly painted, and its shelves were filled with new books, all funded by a permanent, anonymous endowment from the Croft Foundation. Their guests were not the Astors or the Vanderbilts. Their guests were the people who formed the true foundation of their lives. A beaming Clara stood as Eleanor's maid of honor. A proud, if slightly uncomfortable-looking, Mike O'Connell, dressed in his Sunday best, served as Julian's best man. The pews were filled with dozens of steelworkers from the Croft Tower site, their massive frames perched on the small library chairs, their faces filled with genuine affection for the couple they affectionately called the Boss and the Doc. The children of the neighborhood, for whom this library was a second home, peeked through the stacks, their eyes wide with wonder. Eleanor wore a simple, elegant dress of ivory lace. She carried a bouquet not of expensive orchids, but of wildflowers that Clara had picked that morning. As she walked down the makeshift aisle toward Julian, who waited for her by the main reading desk, she did not see a millionaire industrialist. She saw the man who had wrapped her in his warm coat on the coldest night of her life, the man who had seen her worth when she had forgotten it herself. Their vows were simple, their promises profound. When the justice of the peace pronounced them husband and wife, Julian's kiss was filled with a deep, reverent love. The cheer that went up from the assembled workers was louder and more heartfelt than any polite applause at a society gala. It was a celebration of two of their own, a testament to a love that had bridged the chasm between the penthouse and the pavement. The years that followed were a testament to their partnership. The Croft Tower was completed, a magnificent silver spire that redefined the New York skyline. At its grand opening, Julian, in his speech, paid tribute not to the financiers or the engineers, but to the men who had risked their lives building it, and to his wife, Eleanor Croft, who had guarded those lives with her skill and compassion. But their true legacy was not being built of steel, high above the city. It was being built on the ground. 2 years after their wedding, the first Finch Foundation Community Clinic opened its doors on a bustling street in the Lower East Side, just blocks from where the old Chatham Square Library stood. It was a clean, modern, welcoming facility, and its guiding principle was revolutionary. No one would ever be turned away for an inability to pay. Eleanor was not a distant benefactress, she was its heart and soul. She managed its administration, trained its nurses, and knew most of the patients by name. She moved through the crowded waiting rooms with the same grace and authority she had shown at the construction site, her presence a beacon of hope and healing. Julian was her silent partner, his immense resources and sharp business acumen ensuring the clinics were efficient, well-stocked, and sustainable. They opened another, and then another, building a network of care that transformed public health in the city. They filled the quiet halls of the Croft mansion with the sounds they had both been missing. The sound of a family. They had 2 children, a son, Arthur, who inherited his father's thoughtful nature and structural mind, and a daughter, Rose, named for her mother's fighting spirit. They were raised to understand that their last name was not a privilege, but a responsibility. They spent their weekends not at lavish country parties, but volunteering at the clinics, learning from their mother that the greatest wealth was a life spent in service to others. Their love story, once a source of scandal, became a beloved New York legend. The tale of the reclusive Titan and the penniless nurse he found on a street corner was retold as a modern fairy tale, a symbol of the city's own promise that in this great chaotic metropolis, anything was possible. One crisp golden afternoon in the autumn of 1955, some 30 years after they had first met, an elderly Julian and Eleanor sat on a bench outside that first clinic. The world had changed. The Jazz Age was a distant memory. Wars had been fought and won, and the city had remade itself a dozen times over. But here on this street, the legacy of their love was as vibrant as ever. Julian, his hair now a distinguished silver, his movements slower but his eyes still sharp, watched his wife. She was looking at a young mother leaving the clinic, a healthy baby cradled in her arms. The expression on Eleanor's face was one of serene, profound satisfaction. Her hair was grey, and fine lines crinkled around her eyes, lines etched not by hardship, but by decades of smiling. To him, she had never been more beautiful. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked, his voice a soft rumble. "The storm, the doorway. I almost drove right past." Eleanor turned to him, her hand finding his. Her touch was as familiar and as vital to him as his own heartbeat. "I think about it every day," she said. "I think about the girl I was, so lost and cold." She smiled, a gentle, radiant expression that lit up her entire face. She had no idea that she was about to experience the luckiest moment of her life. "I was the lucky one," Julian said, lifting her hand to his lips. "You are the foundation upon which my entire life was built, Eleanor. The very best thing I ever created." "We created it together," she whispered, leaning her head on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the endless, vibrant stream of New York life pass them by. They had defied an era, not with a grand rebellion, but with the quiet, radical act of loving each other. They had built towers and clinics, raised a family, and created a legacy. But as they sat together, hand in hand, under the golden autumn sky, they knew their greatest accomplishment was simply this: a lifetime of shared moments, a partnership of equals, a love story that had, in its own quiet way, truly made history. And so another romance comes to an end. If stories like this warm your heart, consider joining our community of story lovers. By subscribing, you'll secure your front row seat for every new tale of love, passion, and overcoming adversity. Click subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and help our channel grow. Thank you for listening.